Before I get into it, spoiler warning for Dune Part 2 and the first Dune book. Every time there's a movie adaptation of a popular book, there's always going to be a ton of book fans coming out of the woodwork to complain about every single time that the movie changes something compared to the book. I'm not one of those people. I am of the belief that a movie sometimes has to make changes from the book in order to translate it to a different medium, and I think that is especially true in the case of Dune. Now, when it comes to Denis Villeneuve's adaptations of the classic Frank Herbert novel, Dune Part 1 was actually like about as faithful as you could possibly make the first half of the book into a movie, but Dune Part 2 is where he really started to make a lot of those changes. The question is, are those changes actually beneficial to the movie adaptation of Dune? So I think broadly speaking, the biggest difference that the movie Dune Part 2 has compared to the book is that Denis Villeneuve really distilled the story from the book down to the elements that he found to be the most interesting. The book covers a lot of different themes and ideas, from politics to ecology to religion to colonialism, and it has like a huge amount of world building and stuff that goes into it. Denis Villeneuve decided to really focus on the religious aspect of Dune as well as the kind of colonialist aspect of Dune. He kind of sacrificed some of the other aspects, especially when it comes to more of the broader world building, to really focus in on the Bene Gesserit and the religious colonialism aspect of Dune. More broadly speaking, Dune is largely an exploration of two different methods of colonialism and imperialism. The Harkonnen method is through brute force, through fascism, through authoritarianism, basically just being like North Korea on steroids, whereas the Atreides approach is kind of more through religious propaganda, using Bene Gesserit myths to their own advantage, charismatic leadership. The movie kind of really emphasizes how both of these two different methods are used to colonize the Fremen. One of the biggest differences between the movie and the book is that the movie is much more clear in its messaging regarding the religious colonialism and the dangers of charismatic leaders than the book is. Now, you could argue that the book is more subtle and it has maybe more nuance, but a lot of that is kind of hidden in the subtext of Dune. And famously, a lot of people misinterpreted the first Dune book when it first came out. When you compare that to the movie, it's much less subtle and it's much more clear exactly what those themes are. I think part of the reason for this is Denis Villeneuve read future books in the Dune series and kind of applied some of the themes that were more clear in the future books in the series, and he kind of brought that to the first book. And I think he largely accomplished this in the movie by making very key changes to two major characters. The first character that he changed a lot from compared to the book is Lady Jessica. So in the book, there's this thing called the Missionaria Protectiva. It's sort of like this Bene Gesserit plan that they've implemented over the course of hundreds of years of planting different myths and prophecies all across the galaxy in order to be able to use these if they're ever in a spot of danger. The movie doesn't really touch on the Missionaria Protectiva or explain a lot of like the context behind it. What it does do is it kind of makes Lady Jessica the sinister personification of the Missionaria Protectiva. What you see in the movie is after Lady Jessica drinks the water of life and undergoes the spice change, she really starts leaning in towards preaching this propaganda essentially about the Lisan al-Gaib, or essentially Paul Atreides being the chosen one. Of course, it's made very clear in the movie that this is all a myth, it's propaganda, it's used as a means to control the Fremen. Lady Jessica in the movie is all about promoting this myth to the Fremen people and trying to prop up Paul as their messiah, as their leader. There's even directly a scene where Lady Jessica just directly talks about how we need to exploit the fears of the Fremen and convert the non-believers. And throughout the entire movie, she's kind of pulling the strings behind Paul's rise to power. This is much different than how it is portrayed in the book. Like, Lady Jessica in the second half of the book kind of has a more secondary role, whereas in the movie, she's almost arguably the main driving force behind Paul's rise to power. The other major change that Denis Villeneuve implemented to make this theme regarding charismatic leadership and religious propaganda more clear is the changes that he made to Chani or Cheney. I don't know. I've always pronounced it Chani, and that's how they pronounce it in the movie, so that's just how I'm going to pronounce it. The Fremen in the movie are kind of divided between skeptics and believers. It's pointed out that the southern Fremen are more fanatical. They believe in the prophecy, whereas a lot of the northern Fremen don't believe in the prophecy. And Chani is kind of like the voice of reason in the movie, whereas if you compare that to the book, there's not really a lot of skepticism among the Fremen. They're all kind of just falling in line under Paul, and Chani in particular in the book, and I'm not trying to say this in any like negative way towards the book or anything, but Chani is kind of almost like a subservient concubine to Paul, whereas in the movie, Chani is the main voice of reason that is speaking up against what the Atreides are essentially doing to the Fremen. So I think the result of all this is that not only are the themes much clearer, but also Paul's arc as an anti-hero sort of character. And I guess when I say anti-hero, that might not be a correct usage of the term, because in the book, Paul, he kind of actually is sort of a hero. A big part of the book is showing exactly why a heroic type of figure, it could actually be just as dangerous as a villainous type of figure. It's kind of showing the dangers of a hero. So I guess to say whether it's an anti-hero or just a hero that is dangerous, I mean, it's kind of semantics. But the point is, the movie does make it a lot more clear that Paul, what he's doing to the Fremen is kind of a bad thing. Dune is a very complex book, and there's a lot you can get into about, well, Paul was actually just following the golden path. He was following the route to save the most. I mean, I'm not going to really get into all that because I think that's more relevant in the book than it is in the movie. The movie does kind of strip some of that stuff down, and it simplifies the story. You could argue that as a positive or a negative, but either way, in the movie, it is definitely more clear that Paul is sort of an anti-hero, especially after he drinks the water of life. One thing I did see get criticized about the movie, which I think is a fair criticism, is that Paul kind of does have a heel turn. Paul, throughout the movie, he knows that he is not the Messiah. He doesn't want to be the Messiah, but then after he drinks the water of life, he immediately starts to embrace that role. I do think that the movie actually set it up pretty well, because when you see Jessica earlier in the movie drink the water of life, you see her transformation. That kind of signposts what happens once characters drink the water of life and undergo the spice change. So once Paul drinks the water of life, because you know that Lady Jessica already went through this, and you saw what happened to her character, once Paul drinks the water of life, the audience should at that point understand, okay, like, it's going to completely change his perspective. You could argue even that after drinking the water of life, they are no longer the same person who they were before. Completely changes their perspective. I'm kind of going off on a tangent there, I guess. Overall, in my opinion, I actually think all of these changes were beneficial for the movie. I'm not saying that like either way of approaching the story was better. I mean, obviously Frank Herbert was the originator of the story, and the movie is simply just an adaptation, but I do think all the changes that Denis Villeneuve made were kind of necessary to make the movie work as well as it did. I think if you just made a completely faithful adaptation to the first Dune book, I don't think the movie would have been as good as it was. In my opinion, I think Denis Villeneuve did a great job. So the movie definitely also left out a lot of other stuff that was in the book. For example, in the book, you do get to see a lot more about the Spacing Guild, different factions throughout the universe, different stuff about local politics on Arrakis. The movie kind of stripped all of that stuff down and just focused more on the religion and the Bene Gesserit. And I can understand why book fans might not have been happy with this, but again, in my opinion, I think there's just simply too much stuff in the book to adapt everything into a movie. So I do think actually it was a good decision for Denis Villeneuve to strip it down to what he wanted to focus on, which was religion and colonialism. When I was reading the Dune book, those were the things that resonated with me the most about the book. So I'm glad that that's what the movie focused on, but it should be worth noting that if you really like Dune Part 2 and you haven't read the book, it's definitely worth reading the book just to get more of the world building, more context about all the different factions and stuff that are going on. But I do think it was a good decision to simplify the movie and just focus on kind of one major aspect rather than trying to cover everything, because it's simply, there's too much stuff in the book to fit into one movie. Another major change was Aaliyah, the character who is Paul's sister, Jessica's daughter. In the book, she's kind of like this super toddler who kills the Baron and does like all this crazy. It's definitely one of like the weirdest aspects of the book, but I really like that aspect of the book. It was definitely toned down in the movie. Instead of kind of being this super powerful toddler who like just says all this crazy out of pocket, he kind of changed the character to just being a fetus who telepathically communicates to Jessica, which, I mean, that's still pretty weird. I don't know. I actually thought it was a good change. I didn't have a problem with that. I can see why some people would not like that change, just because like maybe this is just me, but I thought all the Aaliyah parts in the book were really funny. I don't really laugh out loud a lot when I'm reading a book, but like those parts actually made me laugh out loud when I was reading them. I don't know if they were intentionally supposed to be funny. I thought like that stuff was pretty hilarious in the book, but I do kind of agree with the decision to tone it down for the movie, just because it would have been really hard to pull that off on the screen, especially if you had to get like a child actor to play those parts. So I don't know. That's not really like a major change in my opinion. I mean, it kind of is, but I don't think it really has that much of an impact on the essence of the story. So I'm okay with that change. I think it was probably the right decision. One thing I thought the movie did a great job of adapting from the book was this sort of like contrast between Paul and Fade Routha. They're kind of almost like two sides of the same coin. They're both sort of like these deified messianic messianic type of figures, just but in very different ways. Fade Rautha, he's kind of like Kim Jong-un on steroids or something like that. Like, he's sort of like being propped up as this authoritarian, dictatorial type of god, sort of in the way that like a totalitarian regime would prop up their leaders as being sort of like this godlike figure. I mean, you see that in the Gladiator arena scene where Fade Rautha is essentially worshipped by the people on the Harkonnen planet, and a lot of that worship is kind of through fear. They're like this hyper turbo fascist type of regime, and Fade Rautha is sort of being propped up in that sense. Whereas Paul, on the other hand, he's being propped up through religion, through his charismatic leadership. It's kind of two different ways of creating a messianic type of figure. Fade Rautha kind of represents like this political messiah. Paul represents a religious messiah. By the way, I thought Fade Rautha, played by Austin Butler, was one of the best characters in the movie. Every time he was on screen, it was just absolutely electric. All of his scenes were just absolute heaters, and I thought they did a great job of bringing justice to that in the movie. I'll also add that all the stuff with the Harkonnen planet and like how he just made them like these absolute freaks with like the black sun that creates like the black and white sort of color scheme, like all of that was just so cool. I love that aspect of it. I have heard some people say that the Denis Villeneuve Dune movies aren't weird enough and they don't do justice to how weird the books are, and I don't agree with that, just because I think some people are projecting the weirdness of the future Dune books onto the first Dune book. God Emperor of Dune is a weird ass book. Dune Messiah, weird book. Children of Dune, those are really weird books, but the first Dune book is, I mean, maybe it was really weird at the time compared to like what we've seen now with all the stuff that's been influenced by Dune. I really don't think the first Dune book was that weird, so I don't really get this criticism about the movies not being weird enough relative to the books, because I don't think the first book was even that weird. And honestly, a lot of the weirdest stuff in the movies is not even in the book. Like in Dune Part 1, like the throat singing concert on Salusa Secundus, the weird spider monster type of creature, everything involving the Harkonnens, they're just absolute freaks in the movie. Obviously, another thing that has been said a million times, but I'd like to add, is how great Hans Zimmer's score and how much that added to the Dune universe. I think the score in Dune Part 1 was already one of my favorite movie scores of all time, and somehow Hans Zimmer topped that in Dune Part 2. It's a score that I regularly listen to on Spotify. I think it's just an absolutely amazing score, and that is just one advantage that movies will always have over books, is the fact that you can add stuff like music, which just enhances everything so much. So as for my rating of Dune Part 2, the movie, I'm going to rate it a 5 out of 5 for my personal enjoyment, and I'm going to say it is a masterpiece. And to answer the question, is it as good as the book, or is it even better than the book? You can't really compare a book to a movie because it's just two different mediums, and there's going to be strengths and weaknesses of both. In the case of the book, the big advantage is that you get more access to the characters' thoughts, and you get also a broader scope of the world and the universe that's being portrayed. But I also think that the movie was able to distill the story down to kind of like these really core interesting themes of the book, and it was able to add like that cinematic flair, like the music, just amazing scenes, amazing action, and all that. So I think both are just great for what they are, and I don't think that the movie could have been a faithful adaptation to the book and been as good as it was. At the end of the day, I'll just say I probably, if I had to pick between one or the other, I actually probably would pick the movie over the book. But I am kind of biased just because I'm more of a movie person than I am a book person. I think both are great, and I think Dune Part 2 did an amazing job of adapting the book, and I have zero complaints really. Thank you for watching, subscribe, and see you next time.